The small-town coffee shop was busy that morning, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee floating through the air and the soft murmur of conversations mixing with the occasional clatter of cups and saucers. People were chatting about their day, laughing at small jokes, scrolling on their phones and enjoying the calm start to a weekend morning. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where familiar faces greeted each other with a nod or a wave. But today something unusual was about to happen. The door opened and in walked an older man. He moved with a steady, confident pace, his posture straight, his shoulders squared. He wore a crisp uniform, neatly pressed with medals and insignia carefully pinned on the chest. His shoes shone under the light and his hair, though gray, was combed back neatly. There was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself, a presence that made people notice even before they realized it. At first, no one spoke. Some patrons glanced up from their coffee or newspapers, nodding politely. Then a few young people in a corner started whispering to each other. They pointed subtly, smirked, and tried to hide their amusement behind hands and phones. "Look at him," one whispered. "Does he really need to wear all that just to get coffee?" The others giggled quietly, thinking they were being clever. The older man didn't seem to notice. He walked straight to a corner table, carefully sliding into a chair. He set his bag on the floor beside him, placed his coffee on the table and sat down. His hands were steady as he sipped from the cup, his eyes scanning the room with calm awareness. There was a quiet dignity about him, a patience that came from years of discipline. He didn't hurry, didn't complain, and certainly didn't seem bothered by the whispers and quiet laughter directed his way. The barista behind the counter watched him closely. She had seen many people come through the door, but there was something different about this man. There was respect in the way some customers instinctively gave him space, even if they didn't understand why. She wondered about his story, about the life he had lived that brought him to this point. She noticed the subtle weight in his gaze, the quiet strength that didn't need to be announced. Meanwhile, the young people continued to whisper and chuckle. "He looks so serious," one said. "I bet he's telling people he's a hero or something." They found the idea amusing, thinking it was all show and no substance. One of them even started recording on their phone, thinking it would make a funny clip to share later. The older man remained silent. He didn't scowl or argue. He simply sipped his coffee and watched. Occasionally, his eyes would flick toward the young group, not with anger but with a quiet awareness, as if he could see more than they realized. There was no tension in his body, no sign of irritation. He simply existed in the moment, composed, steady, and unshaken. As he sat there, memories from his past seemed to linger in his expression. The coffee shop, the chatter, the laughter, it all faded into the background for him. He remembered long days of duty, missions that required absolute focus and moments where patience and discipline were more valuable than any show of strength. He thought about the comrades he had served with, the bonds forged in moments of both fear and triumph. Those experiences shaped him, gave him the calm and confidence he now carried effortlessly. One of the baristas finally mustered the courage to approach him. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked softly, trying to be polite. He smiled faintly, appreciating the kindness. "No, thank you. This is perfect," he replied, his voice calm and measured. It was a small gesture, but it reminded everyone watching that he was approachable, human, not just a figure to be mocked or stared at. The young people continued their whispers, some daring to make louder comments now that they sensed no reaction. "I bet he's going to tell us about how amazing he was in the army," one said, rolling their eyes. They didn't realize that every word they spoke, every laugh they shared was being observed and understood, though not with anger. There was a subtle lesson in his calmness, a reminder that composure often speaks louder than words. Time passed, and the coffee shop's morning rush began to settle. People came and went, chatting and laughing, but the older man remained, quietly enjoying his coffee. His presence seemed to cast a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Even the young group that had been mocking him started to feel a little uneasy, though they couldn't quite explain why. There was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that demanded respect without needing to ask for it. Outside, the sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the medals on his chest. Each one told a story, though few could guess what it was. They were symbols of commitment, courage, and experience, things that couldn't be faked or taken lightly. As he sat there, unaware of the full attention he commanded, The coffee shop slowly realized that this was no ordinary customer. He was someone who had lived a life that demanded respect, a life full of unseen battles and victories. The murmurs and giggles slowly faded, replaced by curious glances and whispered questions. Who was he? What had he done to earn those medals? The older man, however, remained indifferent to the speculation. He simply sipped his coffee, glanced out the window, and enjoyed the quiet moment before moving on with his day. There was a subtle tension in the air now, not from anger or conflict, but from anticipation. People felt that something remarkable was behind the calm exterior, something that would soon reveal itself. The young group, who had laughed so freely moments ago, now sat a little straighter, sensing that their assumptions might be wrong. The barista, watching carefully, felt a mix of admiration and curiosity, realizing that this man's life had stories worth hearing. The older man finished his coffee, placed the cup back on the saucer with deliberate care, and reached for his bag. There was no rush, no urgency. Every movement was measured, respectful, and intentional. The other patrons couldn't help but notice the contrast between his calm confidence and the nervous energy of those who had tried to mock him. He was a living reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that true strength often comes quietly, without need for attention or applause. As he stood to leave, the shop seemed to hold its breath. The older man gave a polite nod to the barista, and a brief smile to those nearby. He didn't speak of his past, didn't boast or demand recognition. He simply moved with the dignity and grace that came from a life of discipline and courage. And in that simple act, he reminded everyone present that some people's stories cannot be judged by first impressions or shallow assumptions. There is always more beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The next morning, the same coffee shop was alive again with its familiar routine. The sound of chatter, steaming milk, and the aroma of roasted beans filled the air. People came and went, but the memory of the old Marine's visit still lingered in the minds of those who had seen him the day before. Especially the group of young people who had laughed at him. They couldn't quite shake off the feeling of guilt and curiosity that had settled in afterward. They didn't expect to see him again. But just before noon, the door opened and the same old man walked in. His uniform looked as neat as before, his medals gleaming faintly under the warm light. He moved with the same quiet confidence, unhurried and calm. Conversations hushed slightly, though no one said anything. People just watched as he made his way to the same corner table and sat down. The young group from yesterday exchanged nervous glances. One of them whispered, "He came back." Another replied softly, "Do you think he knows we made fun of him?" Their words were uneasy, filled with regret now instead of amusement. They watched as he placed his bag beside him and ordered his coffee, his expression unreadable but peaceful. The barista, who had served him before, smiled warmly. She remembered his calm manner and the way he had thanked her with such grace. "Good to see you again," she said, placing the cup in front of him. He nodded with that same small smile. "Thank you," he said. His voice was calm, deep, and steady. It carried a certain warmth that made people listen. The group of young people sat silently, unsure what to do. Their laughter from the day before seemed foolish now. The more they watched him, the more they realized how wrong they had been. His stillness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The quiet way he carried himself spoke volumes about his life and the discipline that defined him. The coffee shop door opened again, and a man in his 30s walked in. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was strong and confident. His eyes quickly scanned the room until they landed on the old Marine. Without hesitation, he walked straight over to the table. The two men looked at each other, and the younger man broke into a wide smile. "Sir," he said with respect, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He stood tall, his posture straight. The old Marine rose from his seat, and the two exchanged a firm handshake. Their interaction drew attention from everyone. The younger man said quietly, "I heard you were back in town. I couldn't miss the chance to say thank you." The older Marine's expression softened slightly. "It's good to see you," he replied. There was familiarity in their tone, something shared between them that no one else in the shop could fully understand. The younger man pulled out a chair and sat with him. The two began to talk, not loudly, but their conversation carried the tone of respect and shared experience. The young group nearby leaned in slightly, trying to listen without being obvious. They caught fragments of words like deployment, honor, and brothers. The realization began to settle. This wasn't just an old man showing off. He was someone who had lived through real experiences, someone who had earned his place through courage and sacrifice. After a while, the younger man stood up, saluted the old Marine, and said, "It's an honor, sir. You taught us what it means to stay strong." He left quietly, leaving the old Marine sitting there once more, his eyes calm, his coffee still warm. The shop was silent for a few moments. The people who had witnessed the exchange felt a shift, a quiet sense of respect filling the space where laughter had once been. One of the young people from the corner finally stood. He hesitated, then walked slowly toward the old Marine's table. The man looked up, eyes gentle but steady. "Sir," the young man began awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for yesterday. We didn't mean any harm. We were just being stupid." His words stumbled out, his face flushed with embarrassment. The Marine studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said softly. "But remember, respect doesn't cost you anything. Sometimes the way you treat others tells more about who you are than what you say." His tone wasn't angry. It was calm, almost kind. The young man nodded, his throat tight with guilt. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, then returned to his seat. The others in his group sat in silence. They didn't dare laugh anymore. Instead, they watched the Marine with a quiet admiration, realizing that he had handled their disrespect with more grace than they deserved. The rest of the shop returned to its usual rhythm, though the mood had changed. Conversations were softer, glances more respectful. The barista noticed it too. She couldn't help but feel grateful that the man had come back, not just for coffee, but maybe for a reason. His presence reminded everyone in the room of something important: humility, gratitude, and the quiet strength of character. As time passed, a few more people approached the Marine to thank him for his service. Some shook his hand, others just nodded. He accepted every gesture with quiet humility, never once making the moment about himself. He seemed genuinely grateful, even for the smallest acknowledgement. The young group stayed seated, watching in silence as the Marine talked with others. They couldn't believe how foolish they had been to mock him. The old man didn't need attention or recognition. He already had something far greater. His dignity came from within, from a lifetime of service, discipline, and sacrifice. After finishing his coffee, the Marine stood once more. He picked up his bag and gave a nod toward the barista, who smiled back warmly. The young man who had apologized earlier stood up again, instinctively straightening his posture. "Take care, sir," he said respectfully. The Marine gave him a small smile. "You too," he said before walking out. As the door closed behind him, the young group sat in thoughtful silence. The one who had spoken up finally said, "You know, we really messed up yesterday." Another nodded. "Yeah, but he didn't even get mad. He just taught us something without saying much." The group fell quiet again, each lost in their thoughts. The lesson was clear. Real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't seek attention or revenge. It simply stands firm, patient, and unshaken. Outside, the old Marine walked down the quiet street, his figure steady under the afternoon sun. People who passed by greeted him politely, and he nodded back. To them, he was just another man in uniform, but to those in the coffee shop, he had become something more, a reminder of respect, humility, and quiet strength. And as the day went on, the small town seemed just a little different. The laughter inside the coffee shop carried a softer tone, the kind that came from understanding rather than mockery. Everyone who had been there that morning knew they had witnessed something worth remembering, a simple but powerful lesson from a man who didn't need words to command respect. The morning was bright, with sunlight spilling through the windows of the coffee shop. The same familiar smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and the sound of quiet chatter blended with the soft music playing in the background. People were relaxed, enjoying the peaceful start to their day. The barista wiped down the counter, glancing at the door now and then. Ever since the old Marine had started visiting, the shop felt a little different, calmer, more respectful. It was almost noon when the door opened and he walked in again. His uniform looked just as neat as always, the metals catching the light in a subtle shine. His calm eyes moved around the room as if reading the mood before taking his usual seat in the corner. Some people smiled when they saw him. The barista greeted him warmly. "Your regular coffee, sir?" she asked. Yes, please, he replied with the same polite tone as before. The group of young people who had mocked him days earlier were there again. They fell silent the moment he entered. They didn't laugh or whisper this time. Instead, they watched quietly, unsure if they should say something. One of them whispered, "He's back again. I wonder why he comes here so often." Another replied softly, "Maybe it's just his routine. Maybe it's where he finds peace." Their words carried curiosity instead of judgment now. When the barista brought his coffee, she said gently, "It's on the house today." The old Marine looked at her, surprised but touched. "You don't have to do that," he said kindly. She smiled. "I know, but we want to. Everyone here respects you." He gave a small nod and smiled faintly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." He sipped his coffee, calm as ever, and gazed out the window. The sunlight reflected off his medals, and people sitting nearby couldn't help but glance his way. There was something magnetic about his presence, strong but peaceful, quiet but commanding. A man sitting at another table finally approached him. He looked to be in his 40s, dressed in work clothes, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. "Excuse me, sir," he said hesitantly. "Were you really in the Marines?" The old man nodded. "Yes, for a long time." The man smiled. "My father was in the Navy. He used to tell us stories about the people he served with. I just wanted to say thank you for your service." The Marine smiled again, the lines on his face softening. "That's kind of you. Your father must have been a good man." The two shook hands, and the man went back to his table. The moment was brief, but it left an impression on everyone watching. The respect between them was quiet and sincere. The group of young people continued to watch. One of them whispered, "He doesn't seem like someone who brags. He's just peaceful." Another nodded. "Yeah, and people come up to him with respect. We were so wrong about him." They exchanged glances filled with a mix of guilt and admiration. After a few minutes, the Marine reached into his small bag and pulled out a framed photograph. He placed it gently on the table and stared at it for a long moment. The barista, curious but respectful, looked at it from a distance. It showed a younger version of him surrounded by several other men in uniform. Their faces were smiling, their arms around each other like brothers. The picture was old, slightly faded but full of life. The group of young people noticed too. One of them whispered, "Is that him when he was younger?" Another replied, "Yeah, and those must be his team." There was a silence that followed, the kind that comes when understanding starts to replace judgment. The Marine lifted the photo slightly and smiled to himself. It was a smile of memory, of good times, hard times, and the unbreakable bond between those who had stood together in danger. He placed the frame back down carefully, his fingers brushing against it gently as if it were something sacred. Just then, the coffee shop door opened again, and a man in casual clothes stepped in. He was fit with short hair and a sharp posture. He spotted the Marine immediately and walked over with a purposeful stride. When he reached the table, he straightened slightly and said, "Sir, it's been too long." The Marine looked up, a flicker of recognition lighting up his eyes. He stood and smiled warmly. "It has," he said, shaking the man's hand firmly. The younger man, clearly a former soldier himself, spoke with deep respect. "Some of the guys are in town. We thought we'd stop by later if that's all right." The Marine nodded. "You're always welcome." The people in the shop watched in quiet curiosity. The group of young people exchanged looks of surprise. "Did he just say some of the guys? Like his old team?" one whispered. Another nodded. "Yeah, that's what it sounded like." The Marine and the younger man talked for a while, their voices low but filled with genuine warmth. They shared stories, laughed quietly, and occasionally grew serious when old memories surfaced. It was the kind of conversation that carried the weight of shared experience, something no one else in the room could fully understand. After a while, the younger man left, promising to return later with others. The Marine sat back down, his eyes thoughtful. He finished his coffee and looked once more at the photograph on the table. There was a sense of peace about him, as if he had already lived through the hardest parts of life and learned to find calm in the quiet moments. The young group finally found the courage to approach him again. One of them spoke softly. "Sir, is that your team in the photo?" The Marine looked up and nodded. "Yes, we served together for many years." Good men, strong, loyal, brave. We went through a lot together." His voice carried emotion but also strength. Another young person asked, "Do you still see them sometimes?" The Marine smiled faintly. "Not often. Life takes people in different directions. But when we do meet, it's like no time has passed. That kind of bond never really fades." The young people stood quietly, taking in his words. There was something deeply human about the way he spoke, not dramatic, not boastful, just honest. They could feel the weight of experience behind every word. Before they could say anything else, the Marine gently picked up his photograph and slid it back into his bag. He looked at the young group and said kindly, "Remember this. You don't have to wear a uniform to show respect or courage. You just have to carry yourself with honesty and kindness. That's what really matters." The group nodded, their eyes filled with newfound respect. As the Marine stood to leave, he gave a small nod to the barista and to the young people, who instinctively straightened in their seats. The barista smiled warmly and said, "See you again soon?" The Marine returned the smile. "Yes, you will," he said softly before stepping out into the sunlight. Outside, the street was busy, but he walked calmly, his steps steady. He didn't notice the quiet admiration from the window behind him, where the people inside the coffee shop watched him go. He was just a man living his day, carrying memories, discipline, and quiet strength wherever he went. Inside, the shop remained silent for a moment after he left. Then one of the young people finally spoke. "I think we just met someone really special," he said quietly. The others nodded in agreement. They didn't laugh or whisper anymore. They just sat there thoughtful, realizing that some people teach the biggest lessons without ever raising their voice. The morning light outside the coffee shop had started to soften when the door opened again. A few customers turned to look, expecting just another passerby, but what they saw changed the whole atmosphere. A group of men entered, their steps steady and confident. They were dressed in plain clothes, but there was something about the way they moved, the quiet alertness, the respect in their eyes that made it clear they were no ordinary men. The old Marine lifted his gaze slowly. A small smile appeared on his face, the kind that only comes when you recognize family after years apart. The men noticed him immediately. One of them gave a short nod, the kind of gesture that carried 1,000 unspoken memories. They walked straight to his table. The room fell silent. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone. The young men who had mocked the Marine now sat frozen, their faces pale. They didn't need anyone to tell them who these newcomers were. Something about their presence spoke louder than words. The lead man, tall with a calm yet commanding presence, put his hand on the Marine's shoulder. "Sir," he said softly, his voice carrying respect that came from deep within. "It's been too long." The Marine stood slowly, straightening his posture. Even with age and time weighing on him, there was still strength in his stance. He looked at each of the men one by one. They weren't just visitors, they were his brothers in arms. Years ago, they had faced storms together, missions that tested every part of who they were. And now, here they were again, standing in front of him in the middle of a quiet coffee shop. The old Marine extended his hand, but the man shook his head and instead pulled him into a firm embrace. The rest of the men followed, one after another. It wasn't a loud reunion. There were no shouts or cheers, just quiet, deep respect, a kind that people who have walked through fire together understand. Whispers filled the room. The young people who had laughed earlier exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't know what to say. The truth had landed harder than any scolding could. They watched as the Marine and the SEAL team shared stories in low tones, a mixture of laughter, nostalgia, and moments of silence that carried the weight of what they had been through. One of the SEALs noticed the half-empty cup of coffee on the Marine's table. Without hesitation, he waved to the barista. "Can we get another for the Colonel here?" he asked politely. The barista nodded quickly, sensing the importance of the moment. She moved with quiet care, wanting to show respect without disturbing them. The Marine chuckled softly. "Still looking out for me, huh?" "Always, sir," replied the man with a grin. "You taught us that." The air in the coffee shop seemed lighter now. The tension had been replaced with admiration. Even those who didn't understand much about the military could see what was happening. It wasn't just about medals or uniforms. It was about loyalty, respect, and the kind of bond that time couldn't break. The group talked for a while. They shared small stories, the kind that hinted at larger ones. Late nights under the stars, impossible missions, quiet victories that no one ever heard about. Every so often, one of them would laugh softly, and the others would join in. The old Marine didn't talk much. He mostly listened, smiling, content just to be among his old team again. At one point, one of the younger patrons, a man in his 20s, stood up and walked over, his face red with embarrassment. He hesitated before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly, I didn't know who you were. I'm sorry for how we acted." The Marine looked up at him. His eyes were kind but firm. "You don't owe me an apology, son," he said gently. "Just remember something, never judge a man by what he wears. Some stories aren't written on the outside." The young man nodded slowly, his eyes wet. "Yes, sir." One of the SEALs smiled and added, "He's right. This man here, he taught us that strength isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who stands the longest." The Marine gave a small laugh. "You boys make me sound better than I was." "No, sir," another said softly. "We just remember the truth." The barista placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of the Marine. Her hands trembled a little as she said, "It's an honor, sir. My brother's in the service." "Thank you." The Marine gave her a warm smile. "Tell your brother to stay safe. And tell him he makes us proud." A quiet moment followed. Everyone in the shop seemed to breathe a little slower, as if realizing they were witnessing something rare, a piece of living history, a reminder that behind every old uniform is a lifetime of courage and sacrifice. The SEAL team eventually sat down with the Marine. They filled the table with laughter and small talk, but underneath it all was something deeper, a shared understanding that didn't need words. Every look, every nod, carried a story that only they knew. One of them leaned forward and said, "You know, sir, we still talk about that day in the desert." The Marine chuckled. "The one where you almost burned the rations?" "Hey," the man laughed, "that wasn't my fault. Someone forgot to check the fuel gauge." Everyone laughed. The sound was warm, genuine. Even the people who had come just for coffee couldn't help but smile. The old Marine's laughter was deep and full of life, echoing through the shop like a song from another time. The group stayed for a while longer. When they finally stood to leave, the SEALs saluted him one by one. It wasn't a show, it was real, filled with respect that words couldn't express. The Marine returned each salute slowly, his eyes glistening but steady. As they left, one of them turned back and said, "We'll see you soon, sir. Don't disappear on us again." The Marine smiled. "No promises." When the door closed behind them, the shop stayed quiet for a long moment. Then softly, the sound of clapping began. It wasn't loud or forced, just a simple, heartfelt gesture. The Marine looked around surprised and nodded in appreciation. He finished his coffee, stood up, and adjusted his uniform. The same people who had once laughed now watched him with respect. As he walked out into the sunlight, the barista whispered to herself, "They laughed at him once, but now they know." The old Marine stepped outside, his steps slow but steady. The day felt different now, brighter somehow. Maybe it was the reunion, or maybe it was the quiet way people had learned something important that morning. Either way, as he disappeared down the street, everyone in that small coffee shop knew they wouldn't forget the old Marine in uniform, or the moment the SEAL team showed up to stand by his side. The next morning, the same coffee shop looked just as it always did. The smell of fresh coffee, the low sound of conversations, and the faint music in the background filled the space. But something about the air felt different. The people who had been there the day before couldn't stop thinking about what they had seen. The image of the old Marine standing tall with his SEAL brothers had stayed in their minds. It had changed how they saw things. The young man who had apologized sat in the corner staring at his untouched cup. He had barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Marine's calm face and heard his words about not judging others by what they wore. It had hit him deeply. He had laughed without knowing the story behind the uniform. Now he wished he had done the opposite, offered the man a seat, a smile, or just respect. Outside, the sound of boots on the pavement drew everyone's attention. The door opened slowly, and once again the old Marine stepped inside. The same uniform, the same medals, but this time no one laughed. Instead, every head turned toward him with quiet admiration. He looked around the shop, his calm eyes scanning the room. When his gaze met the young man's, he smiled faintly and gave a small nod. The young man quickly stood up. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. Morning, the Marine replied. You're early today. Yes, sir. I wanted to see you again. I wanted to thank you. The Marine chuckled softly. You don't have to thank me for anything. Just live with respect. That's enough. The barista behind the counter greeted him warmly. The usual, sir, he smiled. If you remember it, then I'm honored. As he took his seat, the atmosphere felt warm. A few people came over to shake his hand. Some thanked him quietly. Others just smiled. The Marine accepted each gesture with grace, his humility making the moment even more powerful. After a few minutes, an elderly woman entered the shop carrying a newspaper. She looked around and noticed the Marine sitting by the window. Her face lit up. Well, would you look at that, she said kindly. You're quite the talk of the town, you know. He raised an eyebrow with amusement. Is that so? She handed him the newspaper. On the front page was a picture taken from the day before. A blurry photo of the Marine shaking hands with the SEALs. The headline read, Respect earned, not demanded. Underneath was a short story written by someone who had witnessed the scene. It described how an old veteran reminded a room full of people what honor and dignity truly meant. The Marine looked at it for a while, then laughed quietly. I didn't think getting a cup of coffee would make the news. The woman smiled. Maybe it wasn't the coffee, dear. Maybe it was the reminder people needed. He nodded thoughtfully. Maybe you're right. As he folded the newspaper and set it aside, the young man approached again, holding 2 coffees. Sir, I got this for you, he said, placing 1 cup in front of the Marine. I figured it was my turn. The Marine's smile deepened. That's kind of you, son. Thank you. They sat together for a while, talking quietly. The young man asked him questions, not about medals or battles, but about life, discipline, and brotherhood. The Marine answered patiently, his stories filled with lessons about humility, teamwork, and resilience. Every word came from experience, not pride. At one point, the young man asked, Do you miss it? The service? The Marine looked out the window for a moment. Every day, he said softly. Not the danger or the hardship, but the men. The feeling that you're part of something bigger than yourself. You can't replace that. But life goes on. You find new missions, different ones. Maybe teaching respect is mine now. The young man nodded, clearly moved. I think you already started that mission, sir. The Marine chuckled. Maybe. Time passed and more customers came and went. Each time someone new entered, they noticed the old Marine by the window. They didn't see just an elderly man in uniform. They saw a symbol of something timeless. He wasn't trying to be noticed, but respect seemed to follow him naturally. Later in the afternoon, the door opened again. The SEAL team members from the previous day stepped in quietly. They weren't in uniform, but everyone recognized them immediately. The barista grinned as they approached the Marine's table. Back so soon? The Marine asked, amused. Wouldn't miss a round 2. One of them replied with a grin. You're not getting rid of us that easy. The room filled with light laughter. The team pulled up chairs, joining him at the table. The bond between them was clear. It wasn't about words or titles, just mutual trust and shared history. One of the SEALs looked at the young man sitting beside the Marine. You the one who gave him coffee? Yes, sir, he said quickly, nervous. Good, the SEAL replied. Keep doing that. Respect goes a long way. The Marine smiled at the young man. See? It's contagious. They spent the afternoon swapping light stories, joking and remembering the past. The SEALs told tales about how the Marine had trained them years ago, how his calm under pressure had saved lives, and how he always led with heart, not ego. The young man listened closely, realizing he was sitting among real heroes, people who didn't need applause to prove their worth. As the sun began to set, the SEALs stood up one by one. Each shook the Marine's hand again, promising to visit soon. Before leaving, one of them turned to the young man and said, You learned something important this week. Don't forget it? I won't, sir, he replied sincerely. When they were gone, the Marine sat quietly for a moment, watching the fading light outside. The barista came over with the last cup of coffee for the evening. It's on the house, she said gently. He looked up with a warm smile. You don't have to do that. I want to, she said, for what you reminded all of us. The Marine nodded, touched by the gesture. Then I'll accept it, with gratitude. He sat there a little longer, sipping slowly, his reflection visible in the window. For a moment, he saw not just the old man he had become, but the younger soldier he once was. Strong, proud, and full of purpose. It made him smile. When he finally stood to leave, the entire shop grew quiet. People looked up and gave him respectful nods. Some even stood. No one spoke, but the silence was filled with meaning. As he walked toward the door, the young man called out softly, "Sir?" The Marine turned. "Thank you for everything." The Marine smiled and said, "Take care of your country, son. That's how you thank me." Then he stepped outside into the evening air. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow as he walked down the quiet street. His steps were slow but steady. Behind him, the coffee shop buzzed softly again, full of life. But something had changed there forever. Everyone who had seen him, everyone who had heard his words, would carry that memory. A simple morning had turned into a lesson about respect, humility, and honor. They laughed once, but now they understood. And as the old Marine disappeared into the distance, the words from the newspaper headline seemed to whisper in the wind. Respect earned, not demanded.